Welcome to the Design Systems Podcast. We're all about the places where design and development overlap. We talk with the industry experts about trends in design, development, and take a look at new ways to build digital experiences, typically over a beer or two. So, welcome to the Design Systems Podcast. Today is March 24th. We are in the middle of coronavirus lockdown. And so we're here with Evan Lovely, the CTO of Knapsack, and Brad Frost, who is a space cadet, the author of Atomic Design, and is the founder of Brad Frost Web. He's all about making the internet a better place. Thanks for joining us, Brad.
Hey, thanks for having me. I was going to say pretty crazy times.
Yeah, for sure. So in addition to being all about the places where design and development overlap, today we're bringing you the coronavirus quarantine episode. There's the potential for screaming children. There's the potential that Zoom will just die on us at any given time. But we're excited to talk with you, Brad, an industry expert about the trends in design, development, and taking a look at some new ways of building digital experiences. So just kind of kicking things off, if people don't know you, talk a little bit about yourself for just a minute and kind of like why you're into this whole design systems thing.
I'm a web designer and developer, front-end developer, sort of self-proclaimed sort of front-end designer operating on the front of the front end for my whole career. And now at present, for the last 7 years, have been running my own consultancy, so doing work with clients to help build web experiences, but increasingly sort of helping coach organizations and, work with their teams to develop design systems and, all the cultural and process change and stuff that all entails. And sort of before that, I came up through working at different agencies, sort of doing work with big brands there. That's sort of how I got into this whole thing, was sort of doing work with different clients at a big agency in New York City, and started getting the sort of inklings of sort of more, how can I approach my job from a more sort of systematic way? And that sort of dovetailed into running my own business, where I got to sort of poke at that and sort of work at that some more. And that led to the development of a number of things, including Atomic Design, which is a methodology for sort of creating UI design systems, as well as a Pattern Lab, which is a tool for actually implementing that sort of stuff. So I've been at this whole design system thing for a while, and it's been a fun road to sort of help other organizations get their heads around it.
No, and I mean, thanks for your contribution to the whole community. Like, I think that your work has definitely influenced our thinking, as I'm sure many others. And yeah, it's awesome to have you on. Really glad we get a chance to talk about this. So kind of diving right in, Evan works with you on Pattern Lab. Hey, Evan.
Thanks for having me on. It's always great to be talking shop.
For those of you listening that have followed this podcast for a little while now, this was something that was kind of a way for us to capture our conversations that we were having at Basalt with people in the industry about design, technology, those sorts of things. We're actually making a big change at Basalt. We're going to go full on into the product space. And so we're going to be building and marketing Knapsack, which is a design system platform for ambitious product teams. And we're pretty excited to get going on that by the time this podcast is live. Hopefully we'll have a website live at knapsack.cloud where you can check out a little bit more about what we're doing. But it's an idea of creating this shared workspace for designers and developers to collaborate based on what we've been doing about the past 3 years as an agency focused on design systems. So we're really excited to have that be out there. I encourage you guys to check it out. So without further ado, the big question that we got when Brad was going to join the pod was, where does the source of truth lie and why? To kind of give a little bit more context there, there's a lot of design teams that have this mindset of these sketch symbol libraries or these Figma libraries being the place where the true sense of what a digital product should be exists. And there's probably an equal number just as loudly saying that no, like this is something that exists in code. The code is the source of truth for your design system. And that's where everything should live and exist. And that's where ultimately the true definition of what your digital product is. I think that there's a lot of nuance to answering this question, but I'd love to get a take from both of you guys on where you feel like this source of truth conversation is really landing. And I harken back to some of my early conversations with Evan talking about wrestling for control over who is defining a product. And so trying to think about about that product definition. What is some of the nuance there? And like, let's explore that a little bit.
Yeah, it's a great question. I'll say I don't have as much nuance to it. It's the code is the source of the truth. This is this is what actual users see when they visit your actual website or digital product or whatever that is. Everything else doesn't matter at the end of the day. Everything else gets left on the cutting room floor, and so that is the ultimate thing. Is the code. Of course, all of that stuff, whatever artifacts or documentations end up supporting that software, sure, that has value. That thinking that goes on in other tools or wireframes or requirements documentation, anything like that. It's not to say that that stuff is worthless or that design doesn't matter. It's just that everyone has to recognize that at the end of the day, someone types in a URL into a browser, hits the enter button or whatever, or hits a link, and ends up on your website. And the button they see on that website is the button that they will experience, right? Not the static design tool representation of that button or whatever. So the way that we like to frame it, and this is why design systems are so helpful, is that it becomes this like massive opportunity to sort of bring these worlds that have historically been really far apart and sort of siloed together. And so it helps get designers closer to the development side of things, and it also gets development into the design process a lot more. By doing that, you're enabling those designers with the keen eye for, the details and, all the stuff that was historically sort of pixel pushing and stuff like that. It's like we need that, but we need that work to be done in the actual honest to goodness medium rather than in an abstraction that ends up getting this sort of poorly translated by engineers who don't have that eye.
Yeah, absolutely. Like one thing we've always said is get it in the medium that it's destined for. The medium, that browser, has a lot of like unique properties that are not on an image or video. It can be resized. The text can be bumped up and down. There is state, and that is important to be able to get in as early as possible, because you're right, that's what the users experience.
So what would you say to a design team that is then going through a process where they're reviewing comps and they're looking at all of these essentially assets that are feeding a production line, and you have these oftentimes large scale creative reviews of all of this production work that exists inside of a team, and that concrete process that is honestly fairly rigid inside of most organizations, where it goes from designer's desk to the approval in front of a director or a VP that says like, yeah, that's what we're going to build. And then that then goes to a developer that has to build that thing. And that thing is intended to be pixel perfect. Do you feel like that's a cycle that is invalid in some way? Or do you feel like that just needs to shift slightly?
My take on that there is like, there's nothing wrong with comps. There's nothing wrong with design tools, but mistaking it for your final product is the problem. Getting it into that medium that it's destined for as early as possible. If you can actually get it in a web browser very quickly, so you can actually see how it's going to end up working. That's why tools like Pattern Lab or Storybook or Knapsack are so helpful, because they really make it easy to be able to get it in a web browser and start seeing how it's actually going to be like working and feeling as quick as possible without having to worry about all of the back-end data or even the rest of the components and pages made up with it. And it's about a feedback cycle. That designer probably wants to see how those hover states and animation works as well.
One of my favorite stories is working with a big clothing company. We all wear their clothes. And the way that their clothing gets approved is the same way their website gets approved, meaning the creative directors in charge of the website had to print out new versions of the homepage and paste them onto sort of poster board or like the foam board stuff, and then would go to the creative director of the company, which is the same creative director that is approving a new pair of jeans, and she would sign off on the new homepage comp the same way she'd sign off on a new pair of jeans, which is amazing. It's like absolutely amazing.
Yeah, that's crazy.
So the fallacy, though, is that because we have this weird stakeholder approval process means that we therefore have to stick to this process that we've always known with these overwrought comps and stuff like that, and we have to spell it out perfectly. And no, we demand the full mobile comp, the full tablet comp, and the full desktop comp, and have to sort of approve it, sort of bake that 3 times in a static design tool like Sketch or whatever, get that approval, and only then can we start building, because building is expensive and we need to protect our engineers' time and all of that. So coming back to this company, they're like, well, this is why we can't do what you're recommending to us, which is, get into the browser quicker, do our, more iteration there, all of that. And they're like, yeah, but we can't, because we have this approval process. And my answer to that sort of sentiment was, you do realize that the browser has a print button, right? Like, honestly, that's what we're recommending to you. Like, it's like, do what you got to do for stakeholder approval process. And like, all of my clients work in, heavily regulated industries, pharmaceuticals or travel, or like other industries that have way strict legal requirements and stuff like that. They're really, really important to get that right. And there is an opportunity for those processes to change, to sort of adopt a more fluid process as this starts to take root. But in the meantime, there are ways to get creative, to fake it, give them what they need in the sort of formats they're used to, while still updating and evolving your process to be more nimble and, again, sort of get into the final environment a lot sooner. And that's especially helpful once you have a set of components that live and breathe in code. The conversations for adding new features or new screens or new designs or whatever, a lot of times is assembling what you already have. So there's this sort of ability to sort of get a fully functioning prototype of an actual screen done in a matter of minutes oftentimes. And then again, screenshot that, send that over to legal, or send that over to whoever needs to sign off on it to have a conversation about it. But better yet, it's like that's phase 1, is like screenshot it, get them going. But then over time, the opportunity goes, hey, actually visit this URL. This is what we're talking about, whether that's in PatterLab or Storybook or Knapsack or whatever. Like these sort of front-end workshop environments allow us to operate in this world and assemble real code, or the honest-to-goodness sort of view layer of the application. But it's still a comp. And this is like a conversation we have to train our clients with all the time. They're like, so what exactly am I looking at here? It's like, it's sort of like a mock-up, but like, wait, where's this like data coming from? Like, no, you still have to do all of that in the application code base, but we now have this environment that allows us to assemble, manipulate, design, and develop UI code in this sort of like lighter weight environment.
So your story actually brought up something that I've been thinking a lot of, right? Because like when you have somebody that says like, I need to sign off on everything, that is about that kind of level of control of that creative process. And so there is a power and an enablement there inside of an organization that says like, this is the person that has traditionally been like a creative director or a designer, not a developer, that has been there to create the aesthetic of a digital product. And so, when you talk about shifting the source of truth from design to development, or maybe it always lived in development, but people just told themselves it was in design. How do you answer the question of like, all right, well, you're asking me to give up control, or you're asking me to give up some creative power that I have over this digital product in lieu of something that I don't find as empowering. Like, how do you manage that conversation, especially with senior level people in an organization that are very used to doing this and have probably been doing it since like the age of print?
It's a weird sort of mental shift, but to be clear, it's not a ceding of control. The production shifts away from designers' hands a bit, and that's the uncomfortable bit. It's like, well, what do I do with my hands? Because the thing that we have to be clear about, especially with design systems, is like, no, these things don't kill creativity. These things aren't sort of, putting you out of a job. But what we are asking is like, I don't want your pings. I don't want your PDFs or your Zeppelin links. Like, I want your brain. Like, I want your eyeballs looking at the thing that the user is going to interact with, right? And that's more a process thing than anything else. It's helping shift the smart designers' brains away from a sketch canvas and into sort of like reviewing and manipulating and sort of hovering art director over sort of a front end person's shoulder to make sure that their design vision makes its way into the finished product, right? Instead of stopping short of that. It's like Field of Dreams. I can't go past this line. And again, so much of it is just like fear or like, misunderstanding of all of this. But that wall between design and development has always been really, really big. And again, this sort of design system sort of sits just wonderfully right at that wall. And it provides this huge opportunity, the engineers getting closer to the design side of things. And like that to me feels like a really healthy place to exist. So in the teams that we work with, there's always a ton of education that goes on and helping talk down the designers. It's like, no, we're not asking you to give up your livelihood and the things that you're very skilled at. But what we are asking you to do is to direct that at the actual software to make sure that your vision makes it in there.
So you definitely view it as like a shift in the role, even so much as, not doing that production work in exactly the same way or not looking at things in the same way. It's not a gigantic departure, but for a design system to feel empowering, it requires people to shift the way that they work. And Evan, I really want your take on this too, because I think it is important to understand from both of you guys, like, how does that shift take place inside of an organization?
Yeah, there's a lot there.
Tiny topics. We're all about the small things here.
I know. Brad, when you were talking there's one thing that jumped out to me. Engineering is expensive. Like that's why we don't want to get into that. It's costly. And the thing that everybody's forgetting is that we're not engineering the whole thing. Don't worry, like we're not working on authentication yet. We're not working on the actual flight data. We're not actually like, those things do take a long time and you want to minimize the iteration on those. And so I think that is like a fallacy everyone has in their head. Like, oh, you coded it, it's the whole thing, it's in a browser, it's done, I see like results coming back and you're like, well, those are just like fake ones. John Doe's actually didn't book a flight, don't worry. I think that is the missing gap a lot of times, because writing kind of the front of the front end code is pretty dang quick, especially if there's already some components in there, because if you already have a lot of things built up, wow, it can get real quick, on being able to do that stuff. And I always tell people that it's, just an environment that excels at dummy data, and really like your CMS is an environment that excels at like having a visual UI for being able to input that data. And so yeah, being able to, quickly get it into that medium, I think is like super helpful. And designers need to be able to give an idea out to a developer. Nothing wrong with that being in comps, and just be like, all right, let's go ahead and get this stuff in. I have an idea. I would encourage it to be kind of a little ugly, right? And like let the developer like iterate on it real quick and, apply some stuff and then present that piece. Obviously, the designer should see it back and be like, oh, okay. When I showed you the hover state and the actual state, I was imagining animation between the two. And you're like, you have 2 seconds? Okay, how's that look? Have you ever gotten comps in video, like for animation? I feel so sorry for how long it took them to put that together. That could have been done in a tenth of the time with just a conversation between two people.
The phrase that we use a lot is minimum viable artifacts. What's the quickest thing that needs to be created in order to convey the right thing to the right people at the right time? And so sometimes that is a full-on comp. Sometimes that is a motion prototype. Sometimes that is like a napkin sketch. What are we actually trying to accomplish, and what's the quickest way to get there? And Evan, your point is really important there, was that a lot of times nothing needs to be produced except just for two peers to sit down as equals and work through a problem together by talking, the thing that we're sort of hardwired to do as human beings. It's just really, really crazy that there is so much built up, and now increasingly a lot of really well-funded software that is keeping that wall between designers and developers.
Yeah, and I think that's what's like so important about these tools that get it in the medium it's destined for, because if two people are talking about something that they can't actually look at, it's subjective instead of objective. Like if a designer, like if you didn't have anything to look at in the actual medium, like a designer could say, oh, it should work like da 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 da, and then the developer's like, oh, okay, cool, and they both are like, I understand, and they don't. and it's like it because it's in people's heads. But if you can actually point to something in the medium it's destined for and actually see and be like, okay, that the unknowns get drastically smaller.
No, it's interesting to hear you guys talk about that, especially the vested interest in keeping a wall between design and development. I feel that in a very real way, where it feels to me like there's a lot of organizations out there that are trying to get people to build better comps that are more like web pages and less about things that are trying to shift the way that people work. And I think that because largely like shifting the way that people work is a little bit hard of a problem. You think it'd be easy to say like, hey, in your creative review process, like look at a web page instead of a sketch file. But that is probably more nuanced or there's a bigger bridge to build there than just those words that I said. But at the same time, kind of hearkening back to one of our earlier conversations with Dan Mall, Dan kind of frames this in the picture of Agile, right? Where the least amount of comps that you can build is also the same thing as favoring working code over documentation, which is one of the tenets of Agile. And I think this relates dramatically to the idea of what's happening in the digital space, right? Like everybody's going through digital transformation. Like I feel like, every agency project that we get these days is got a digital transformation component to it, right? And a large part of that is because there's more demand than I would say ever before on digital product teams to build new features, to manage screen widths, to do all of these other different features associated with their digital products. And I think, Brad, we use a quote from you on this in some of our slide decks about the just absolute crush that product teams are under in terms of innovation. These traditional sort of siloed, rigid processes of like the comps go to a director, the director signs the comps go to a developer, more than just being inefficient, also just like really slows the process of innovation down. And so when I think about like how design is enabled by design systems or how developers are enabled by design systems, I think about it in terms of agility. Like no longer do we have to like argue about how this particular element should be bumped 3 pixels left. We actually just have something in front of us that is working code that we get to kind of rally around as the place to innovate. And I think that to me seems to be a big change in the conversation right now is like, I feel like the place to innovate is shifting out of the realm of design tools. And that's exciting.
Yeah, I agree. And my colleague, Josh Clark, talks a lot about this as well. It's sort of talking about a design system sort of being boring and how that's a good thing. And it's not to say that it produces boring sort of flat designs, but it's that it just takes care of a lot of that sort of just rote work. You don't have to futz around with a border radius value. Instead, you could figure out, how do I shave off 4 inputs from this form that's going to like lead us to convert a lot more, or whatever the metrics might be, or how might we sort of rethink this thing. It's like now, because you have less designers sort of drawing rectangles, you actually free up their headspace to solve problems more creatively.
And I also doubt you're gonna ever run into a designer that is like, yeah, I went to design school to draw rectangles. Like, most of the people I think have this aspirational idea of a more creative, innovative process for what they do, instead of like, how many form fields can I stuff on this artboard?
Yeah, but it very much becomes a what do I do with my hands situation. And in my experience, it's like all the people whose job it is to just produce all of these artifacts, all this documentation and stuff. It's like, look at me, like I could tangibly point to the stuff that I personally am responsible for. And whenever you sort of do away with that idea and the software becomes the source of truth, that's the only thing that matters, the actual product that people interact with, it's harder for those people to say like, I helped make that, because their hands weren't necessarily writing the code that that wrote border radius 8 pixels or whatever that might be, but absolutely they are responsible for the success of that software. So there becomes a matter of sort of like a motivation, but also sort of like metrics and reward systems, and like how are people motivated, like what gets them a raise and stuff like that. Like all of that needs to change. So you were alluding to it a little bit before. It's like, it's way easier to just be like, just use this tool and this will go better.
Right.
It's just like such like a crude way of thinking, when what we're really talking about is there's just such an opportunity to sort of transform culture and process, and like how people do work together and make great products together. Easily one of the most fulfilling parts of my job is to sort of help those people down that road and say, like, look, like if you literally just wheel your desks together and look at each other's screen, you're going to make better software. And to have it click, and then to have a lot of this, you know, process stuff and organizational stuff and cultural stuff fall into place to sort of reinforce that sort of new process. You just see these teams go from this very just sort of blah Henry Ford, you know, assembly line kind of thing, and into something that is a lot more dynamic and more collaborative, and that again gives me an enormous sense of fulfillment there.
Yeah, totally. I mean, that sounds like the kind of digital product environment I want to work in. So shifting gears for a second, you mentioned a good design system is kind of boring. I agree. Like you have these rules and these guidelines that are this code for how you interpret the way that you're going to create a digital product. One of the things that we've done in this industry is we've gotten really, really good at that with the web. That's because the web has the ability to inherently be like pretty modular, pretty encapsulated. You can build a component and throw that up as a web page and kind of see it work. A question that we're starting to get asked all the time is like, okay, what about native apps? Specifically, like, how is it that I can create a design system that works for native apps and that works for things even beyond native apps, like Internet of Things type stuff, right? And you hear about the work that the folks over at Spotify are doing, and the really cool stuff with like, their app running on a refrigerator and on Alexa devices, and how their design system helps kind of power all that. In a practical sense, when we think about things that exist beyond the web, how do design systems serve those kind of digital products?
It's a great question. It's something that most of our clients are wrestling with, right? Again, sort of work with larger organizations. So once you hit a certain size, of course, you have at least one iOS app and at least one Android app, right? If you're sort of like a singular company, but then like, there's hundreds of brands within those companies that all have their own hundreds of iOS and Android apps and web products. And it is really fascinating, I think, to consider it. How do we actually control all of this? Design tokens has sort of proven to be an effective way of, at least, it's like, even though we can't share our entire code base, an accordion opening and closing and stuff needs to be written, in their respective software stack. But if the sort of very primitive design variables of that, right, the color of the text, or like the icon itself can be shared, but also just things like...
Yeah, so I mean, for people that want to do more than design tokens and have the will to make these process changes, like, how are we starting to eat away at the margins on some of these gaps? What are some other ways that we're really starting to make inroads into this space? And thinking beyond all those places, like, I mean, even if this isn't something that is practical, if this is something that's a lot more notional or aspirational, if you will, like, where do you see this all headed? Like, are we going to end up having these design systems that power the experiences for our entire digital ecosystem at a level that is beyond, design tokens? Or is that something that you don't really see us getting to in the near future?
In addition to the design tokens, which is those are like, that's an actual shared thing. There's sort of more of a aligning guidelines and stuff, which isn't the same as like sharing code or like actual sort of design variables. You're at least able to sort of say like, okay, here's an accordion. Here's the guidelines around when to use an accordion. API design and stuff like that, as I'm finding more and more, is like really, really hard work. You're creating a language for like working with UI, and that's hard earned. And so there's actually the opportunity, even if these things are written in totally different languages, to still use the same vocabulary helps sort of create some glue and some cohesion across the company. But again, it's worth sort of reiterating the point that it's still a manual effort to create, these sort of separate code bases, but the hard work of sort of, designing the API and like figuring out like what the right shape of these things are from a code perspective is actually something that can translate to these different environments. And that's why you see design systems that have sort of bitten down on different sort of framework implementations.
So one thing you said there jumped out to me, and that's kind of the talking about the API design. And it's really easy to think of like API design as, oh, you mean like a REST API or a GraphQL API? And like, no, I really like the term where it's like APIs where two pieces of code meet, you know? So this is like your data contract. To all the React folks out there, these are your prop types. And so I find that is something that's like really powerful to be talking about. This says a lot to a lot of different people. You know, if you are talking to a content editor, this is roughly the form they fill out to kind of add the content to this component. If you are talking to a designer, these are your variations. You basically have like if your card has a prop of image align that's got to be either left, right, top, or bottom, there's your variations you need to be able to design. And if you're a developer who also hears that, then you know, like the different situations you have to be able to prepare for. And I feel like there could be a big shift in how we work where we come together to talk about the API design. A lot of times we refer to that as the spec, but a bunch of people coming together to be like, all right, we have a need for something that takes an image, a title, optional call to action. You know, the image can either be top, left, right, or bottom, and just that right there. And then I feel like the content editor, the designer, and the developer could be like, okay, break, and they all go to their corners and then come back together and be like, all right, I've got some copy, I've got some good images that signify this stuff, and some different sites to go to, real content. And I think that could be like really, really powerful there to be kind of talking about that. This is also super important because it's your promise to the people that use it. If you're like a developer who made the card and then there's another developer who's using the card, should probably not change that prop name from image align to media align without doing some important stuff, like basically either communicating that, having some backwards compatibility, or, doing some like appropriate version bumping with like semantic versioning. What you were just talking about was basically like, all right, these different native apps, the iOS apps, the Android apps, we might not be able to share the code, but we could keep that same data contract, that same API, those same props. And talking about that spec can go a really, really, really long way. One thing I'd like to hear from you, Brad, is if you're seeing anything like that in these organizations, or if conversations are starting to happen around, the API design or the spec or the prop types, or is that something that just the developers are actually like kind of figuring out themselves?
It's a great question, and I really love everything you just said. I feel like that's what I've been in the weeds with our clients for a little bit. I'll share a story working with a company that's sort of baking their React library and sort of baking that into AEM and surfacing a lot of the React components to be able to be sort of accessed and dropped in, sort of like Gutenberg blocks in WordPress or whatever, like into a page, so that content authors can assemble new landing pages or marketing pages or whatever article pages using the design system's ingredients, but by way of the sort of editor window, right? Like the admin, the CMS admin. And that sort of sparked the conversation between, of course, all the sort of content people at the organization and the developers and the designers. And they like had to, by way of, we need these content authors to be able to build these pages and sort of democratize this work, because historically it was like all bottlenecked into, oh, we need this landing page, which means we need the engineers to touch it, which means that's expensive and costly. And this has existed for a long time, but like, in the CMS, you could just drop in your blocks. Oh, I need a hero here. I need this sort of strip of like 3 cards in this carousel or whatever that features these things, and I need the title to say this and all of that. It's like they're hitting it from a different angle. Here's the form they need to fill in for the hero. Right, here's the URL to the image, here's the title, here's what I want the CTA text to be, here's where I want that CTA to take you. And they're hitting it from, obviously, trying to build a page that does a specific thing, but they're interacting with it in this different way. Now, and then there's the developers that sort of consume the component on the back end, and they're sort of interacting with the same props, and as well as some additional sort of invisible props that don't get serviced to the CMS. But yeah, so you end up with this, like, it has to be this coordinated effort between all of these different team members. And you find it a lot with like sort of the people who are trying to maintain these sort of sketch libraries and stuff as well, trying to match that language between development. What did you call this thing? Did you call this text, or did you call this label, or did you call this align, or did you call it vertical align, or did you call it, you know, all of that stuff? Is this like just a toggle switch, or is this a string? Like, it's like designers, and I'll say that, like, as we've gone through this is sort of new science, I think, for a lot of designers. I don't think, you know, they're used to layer copy 4, copy 7, copy 15, like in the Photoshop days. And so it is like requiring, I think, sort of a more systematic approach to design that I think, in my experience at least, a lot of the teams that we coach, it's sort of new to them, whereas the developers are a little further down the road there. But again, that's okay. Again, like, whenever you sort of approach it as like everybody is coming together to collectively establish this language together, there's all sorts of opportunities to learn and grow and evolve, and that's super healthy. It's a really cool, and I don't think it's talked about as much. So I'm glad that we're talking about that here. I think that it's like a very seemingly technical thing, but what we're really doing is talking about building a language together, building like a vocabulary together, and that's really, really fun.
Absolutely. There tends to be like kind of two sides of the conversation of design systems, right? Like, what happens when you actually have one? Like, what are the things you can layer on top of it, like automation and testing and those sorts of stuff? But one of the things that we don't talk a lot about is like the net effect of this, of like you said, like developing this shared language and what that really means. We always talk about, like, you know, put a shared language glossary together or whatever, right? And that has value. Like, that documentation has value. But when you actually are applying that in the practical application of your code amongst lots of different digital products via something like an API, that's where that really goes from something that is valuable as an artifact to valuable as something that's in practice.
The more concrete it is, and the more sort of actionable or sort of baked into like tools or technologies or whatever, the easier it is to enforce and all of that stuff, right? It's like you can create a brand guideline, or you could create like a big PDF that like defines your whole design system, including like, here's all the code for it. But it's like, the more locked up and productized it is, the easier of a time you're going to have sticking to it and enforcing it and stuff like that. And that's why, like, at present, the disconnect between the like sort of static design tool world and the code world, there's a lot of room for human error, and like there's a lot of like duplication of like that has to happen, which why are we maintaining this sort of like sketch library like this? Like, this seems like a lot of effort to do, but of course there's different startups and stuff like that sort of trying to solve that problem and stuff, which I think is really fascinating. But that's just like sort of one slice of it. Again, getting the content people in there and everybody else involved is like, again, more of a process and cultural thing.
Well, you just mentioned there is a, you know, the brand guidelines in a PDF that could contain code, and I kind of like shivered a little bit.
Sorry, Evan.
yeah, I don't think so. I don't know. That would be a tough one to keep up to date, right there. But
yeah, I mean, I've seen it. I've seen it.
I actually feel really bad for anyone who has to, you know, keep up to date these artifacts, and you know, they know that they're, you know, a significant part of them are not being used. I mean, they could have easily been like wonderful stepping stones, you know, planning on the way of building this. But I feel bad for any designer who's like, all right, well, I got, you know, 4 screen widths, and they've got like the card can be top, left, right, or bottom, and I'll just show those different ones, and yep, it looks the same on tablet desktop, but I guess I'll make that one too. And
no, the insanity is the people that then go and take what is in code and then backport that back into Sketch. Like, I always wondered why that exists. And, you know, I'm sure that one of our listeners could probably tell me like a good reason for this, but one of the things that is shocking to me has always been like, okay, you have this thing that is in a live environment. Now I need to take all that stuff that was like a gap in fidelity from the first design and then backport that back into my sketch assets. I'm like, oh my gosh, I can't imagine doing that.
Yeah. Well,
like, how do you even find all the differences?
Yeah, I'll tell you that there absolutely is value to it, especially in these like huge companies. So just to sort of paint the picture, again, like a lot of the companies that I work with are like a company that sort of manage hundreds of brands, and they have like hundreds of agencies servicing those hundreds of brands. And so the opportunity exists for all of those hundreds of agencies that are all creating these hundreds of brand websites and digital experiences to be running from the same sort of like sketch library and whatever, and sort of to pump like the appropriate brand stuff through. And coming back to our conversation about the API design and stuff, so long as that sketch library is truthful and is at parity with what's in code, you are able to sort of effectively have these hundreds of agencies producing hundreds of different designs that are all realistic. Like they're all able to be implemented using the coded design systems components. That's all. I think that is really, really powerful, but it's also worth saying that that doesn't come for free. It's like a lot of work and you have to constantly maintain that parity. And as things, once you have the design system in place and living in code, it does absolutely become a matter of just sort of perpetually sort of backfilling the sketch library to sort of match what the truth is in code, including things like, Evan, like you're saying, it's like, oh yeah, if we make a change to this prop or make a change to what we're calling this thing, we need to make sure that is true, especially whenever you start operating at a scale that involves this sort of these concentric circles of people making digital products on behalf of an organization. It's crazy. So it's not to say that it's like it has no value. It's like it can be better, and it's fine to do that. It's fine to operate like that. But just recognize that you're still working in an abstraction.
I hear you. I could definitely see that for the more systematic approaches. I was kind of thinking about like, if you don't have a design system, there's entire people and entire teams right now that look at like, okay, I had this comp equals this web page, but this web page is different than the comp. Let me backport all those changes from that web page back into my comp. And that, like, I see that as like, okay, if you're talking about a design system where those are components, and that is like the strictness of the documentation that you've decided you value as a design system is bi-directional like that makes sense. But like when you talk about like this one-off experience, it feels like to me like sometimes there's a lot of people that are just updating things inside of DesignLam to try to preserve this parity of truth that maybe doesn't need to exist. So, hey, Brad, I just want to say big thanks for being on the podcast today. It was great to get your take on this stuff. Awesome to chat with you as always. Evan, likewise, always great to have you on. Listening to you guys talk about design systems and what's next, man, it's been really great. So just want to say thanks a bunch to both of you. Really appreciate you both.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Yeah, it's great being on. I always love talking shop. It's fun problems to be talking about. It's interesting space, too. It's sure to be changing rapidly in the years to come.
Yeah, and the one other question that we did get from the crowd, most of who saw your talk at Event Apart, Brad, they wanted to really understand your opinion about React.
I sort of made some peace with it. I think that I ended up publishing a really long blog post that we could maybe sort of share in the show notes or something, but that sort of covers sort of where I landed with it, and it's to say there is a lot of value, and I'd say it all sort of comes back to what we were talking about earlier of like this sort of bundled up sort of components that expose an API. You're able to sort of exhibit sort of like, or sort of centrally control your front end code so that you don't have a bunch of people copying and pasting and markup and styles and stuff and then sort of hacking it to pieces. So there's a lot of value in these sort of directly consumable UI components, and that in my view is the best thing that React provides, is this notion of here's the sort of bundled up UI library that you could sort of pull down and then just sort of pull in an accordion, and wouldn't you know it, the accordion works and all of that. So that to me is super powerful, but that's also not React specific. That is,
No, we're taking this to the extreme. Brad Frost on this podcast has officially recommended React for any web project that's out there.
You don't need my recommendation. It's already happening.
That's all for today. We'd love to hear from you with questions, ideas for new episodes, beer recommendations, or comments. You can find us on Twitter @TheDSPod. Cheers, and thanks for listening to the Design Systems Podcast.